It is time to turn to our speaker. So I want to introduce Ben Weise. Again, he's the Ag Conservation Manager with the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. Ben's going to talk a bit about carbon farming, a potentially key strategy in addressing climate change that his agency, the RCD, is working on with or helping farmers and ranchers implement in Contra Costa County. And he may have more up-to-date stats than me, but with Contra Costa County home to more than 400 farms covering some 150,000 acres, if carbon farming is a successful approach to capturing carbon from the atmosphere, this could play a key role locally, and obviously perhaps could be and is being tried nationwide and worldwide. Ben's a Walnut Creek native, but he was raised in SoCal. He has 2 master's degrees from Indiana University, one in natural resource management, the other in environmental policy. He did his undergraduate studies at UC Berkeley, and a side note, he was a member of Cal's famous marching band. And he joined the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District in 2017, where he manages a variety of conservation programs focused on agricultural lands in the county. It's my pleasure to turn the mic over to Ben Weise.
Good evening, everybody. Everyone can hear me? Everyone can see my presentation? All right, great. So yeah, I'm here to talk to you guys tonight about specifically what carbon farming is, carbon farm planning. It's a program that we've developed here at Contra Costa RCD and has more or less, I think, been implemented statewide at all the other resource conservation districts too. Feel free to drop questions down in the chat. If I see them, I'll try and answer them in real time. Otherwise, I will try to answer them towards the end. So before I get going, I just wanted to give a quick plug for resource conservation districts. I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with those. We're relatively unknown, unfortunately. But there are something like 90 plus of us statewide. Here is a map of California with all of the current resource conservation district boundaries throughout the state. So more or less, we exist as a branch or a special district, like a school district or a hospital district or something like that. And our entire focus is on protecting and conserving natural resources within our county. A lot of our work was born out of the Dust Bowl era. So we kind of came about at that time to help farmers address natural resource concerns on their properties. Most of our, I would say, programming historically was geared towards agriculture, but has certainly shifted to meet the needs of our local community. So here in Contra Costa, we have a highly urbanized western part of the county, kind of a mixed urban and then open space in the middle part of the county, and then the Delta and the agricultural portion mostly over in the eastern part. So we're a little unique in that we meet, basically all RCDs are unique in that they rise to meet the local need. As on the whole, we are funded primarily through grants and contracts that we're able to go out and get through state agencies or federal agencies. We do get a small sliver of the property tax, the 1% statewide or countywide property tax, but that mostly just covers our operating expenses. So pretty much everything we do from that point on is grant funded or fundraised through ourselves. So then just to give you a quick peek at what our specific office looks like, or I guess our governance, so to speak. So we have the executive director, he's my boss. His name is Chris Lim. We have an office administrator, her name is Patty. And then we have a bunch of program staff that do a variety of things. So I have another person that works with me primarily on agricultural issues here in Contra Costa County. We have 5 folks that work all throughout Contra Costa working with various watershed support groups. So like in your guys' area, certainly the Walnut Creek Watershed Council, was it Friends of San Ramon Creek, Friends of Pleasant Hill Creek, I forget, there's so many creeks in Walnut Creek. So there's a lot of good work happening in your guys' area. And then we also have 3 field staff that are working primarily on invasive weed issues and restoration projects throughout Contra Costa. All of us ultimately report to these 5 individuals you see over on the right. These are our board of directors. They are all volunteer members. They Some of them are retired, some of them are still working. They were all appointed by the Contra Costa Board of Supervisors. As we're currently structured, we have 5 board members that ultimately dictate what we do and approve of grants and contracts and all that. But then we are also allowed to have an unlimited amount of associate directors that provide feedback and provide direction. We've had all sorts of folks come through. So if you've got knowledge you would like to pass or you want to get more involved with the Resource Conservation District, feel free to drop in on one of our board meetings. We're always looking for associate directors to help guide our programming and what we're doing here in Contra Costa County. So then to talk a little bit just quickly about what we do, what type of work we do. Over on the right is kind of more my realm here. This is a great picture out on the far eastern part of Contra Costa County. We were able to connect Urban Tilth, which is a group out of Richmond, and a small urban farm with first generation farmers, an outfit out in eastern Contra Costa that's working to train young farmers in regenerative agriculture and all sorts of good stuff. So we help foster that connection. We support those type of things. On the far left is my boss, Chris Lim, working actually in the Walnut Creek watershed to remove Arundo donax, which is an invasive weed that you're going to find in the creeks. It was a really good work day. You can see we filled that holloway right there with just invasive weed material. And then here in the middle is actually the Wildcat Creek fish ladder for salmon. So they built that, I believe, in the 60s. And every so often it fills with sediment, so we have to go back in and get all the sediment out to make it a viable fish ladder so salmon can get up. So we do a whole bunch of work in restoration and agriculture and education and invasive weed and restoration. So we got a lot of cool stuff going on. Feel free to plug in and learn more about us. Absolutely. Yeah, so then specifically on the Ag Conservation Program, I work with Derek Emmons, and together we run this program. So we more or less work with farmers here, farmers and ranchers in Contra Costa to improve the conservation value on their land. Whether that be through the removal of illegal dumping that often and frequently occurs in eastern Contra Costa especially, but all throughout the county, working to restore some rangelands, get some better grass seed out there, or improve habitat for endangered species and provide livestock ponds for cattle and stuff up in the rangelands. There's all sorts of stuff we like to do. But today I'll talk specifically about carbon farm planning. So what is carbon farming? It's a pretty, I don't know if I like it as a descriptor because all farming is carbon farming. The entire idea behind it, right, is that we are pulling CO2 and other nutrients out of the soil and out of the air and ultimately making something that we can use, right? So food, fiber, all sorts of good stuff. The term carbon farming, when you hear that, typically what that means is we're looking at a specific farming system and seeing how we can increase the carbon capture and the carbon sequestration on farms. So as a quick example here, you see on the left, I believe that's an almond orchard. What we would like to do, or what we would recommend with folks, is you can see that patch of grass and some flowering, maybe some weeds there in the middle. That's a practice we'd like to call cover cropping. So otherwise that would be bare dirt that's not really functioning or doing anything. But if we can throw some grass seed down on there, now we're putting plants in the ground. That's going to sequester carbon. That's also going to provide pollinator benefits. That's going to improve soil health. It's going to do all sorts of good stuff. Here in the middle, this is a hedgerow. It's a pretty straightforward concept. On the left, you've got kind of this row crop agriculture over here. You've got some more row crop agriculture here. Here in the middle, there's nothing going on. So let's put a strip of plants that are going to provide pollinator habitats and wildlife habitat. And at the same time, they're going to be sequestering carbon. So we're looking at all of these practices that are going to increase the conservation value on these farms, but specifically looking for practices that really result in carbon sequestration. That's kind of the impetus behind carbon farming. So then carbon farm planning is where we go out and work with these individual farmers to identify practices that they could be doing. That, you know, a lot of these guys have been doing the same thing for 30 or 40 years or 50 years. And, you know, my grandfather did it, his grandfather did it. You know, I'm just going to keep doing it the same way. It's like, well, you know, there might be a better way to do that. So we work with these guys. We identify problems they may be having on their farms. maybe a particular orchard isn't producing as much fruit because the soil health is poor. Maybe they're not getting enough pollinators, and they're not getting as much fruit in a particular area. So based on kind of that feedback, what we learned from these guys, we're able to provide recommendations for various management practices that could benefit them. It could include things like compost application or mulching, putting stuff on the ground that's going to increase the soil health and increase the microbial community down in the soil that will then result in more carbon sequestration. So then after we kind of do that initial site visit, then we come back to the office, or in this case, we sit around a table and talk a bit more about what these various practices are, but then we also try to arrive at how much sequestration is actually happening. So this research group out of Colorado State University, I believe, in partnership with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, created this tool called Comet Planner. And more or less what this tool does is it has all of the management practices that we know sequester carbon. And basically you just input whatever acreage you're planning to do, and then it'll spit out a value of this is how many tons of carbon dioxide are going to get sequestered annually if you implement this practice, or every 30 years or something like that. So we put all of this together in a planning document for these farmers, so that way they have it in front of them, and then they can go to funders and say, hey, look, we want to do this practice. We want to, get this carbon going into our soil and into the ground. We have these documents and we've already worked with these guys to figure out how to do it. We just need the funding to get it done. So they get a great tool out of that. And then sometimes when they actually get out there and implement it, they can maybe, start to brand around it or increase their farm sales. There's a group up north called Fibershed. They work primarily with sheep farms that are producing wool. So, and what they were able to do is do a bunch of carbon farming with these guys and then actually pay to get the practices implemented. And then as a result, they were able to work with the North Face and develop a beanie. They now sell a beanie in their stores that is made with wool from these farms that are implementing these carbon farming practices and sequestering more carbon than they're emitting. And they've branded it as the Climate Smart Beanie. I think the tagline is "Warm your dome, not the planet." So we're looking at these creative ways to get farmers involved in this stuff, because it's, as someone mentioned, there's people that are maybe still on the fence about climate change, but it doesn't have to be about that every time, because a lot of these practices are going to provide a host of other benefits in the form of pollinator habitat or wildlife habitat or better water efficiency. We like to talk up these multi-use things. And I never look at one thing as just a climate thing. There's so much more involved in it. So when I was watching the NOVA video and looking at these trees, I was like, yeah, the trees are great. They're going to sequester a ton of carbon, but think of all the birds and the bugs and the mammals that are just going to be so happy in these forests now. That's what keeps me feeling good. So then the photos that I just showed you are actually from the first carbon farm plan that we developed here in Contra Costa County. It was with Frog Hollow Farm. They're out here in Brentwood. They're a 240-acre, you name it, orchard. They've got peaches, apricots, all sorts of vegetables, almonds, and just everything. I would say that they're probably on the leading edge of some of this regenerative agriculture stuff. So we worked with them back in 2018 to develop their plan. You can see the title page of it here. And then based on what we saw with the farmer, we were able to recommend all of these practices that they could potentially implement on their farm, and then do the calculation to determine that, per year, if they were to fully implement all of these practices as we estimate them, they're going to put down, almost 110 metric tons of carbon dioxide every year. And over 20 years, that works out to just about 1,100 metric tons of carbon dioxide. That's a lot. So there's hope out there. And it's, that I would agree with the people that were talking earlier that I'm watching that NOVA series. I thought it was great. I thought it was interesting. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a tech guy. I'm more inclined to let nature do it. Nature's already figured out how to get all the carbon dioxide out of the air. So let's let her work. And that's exactly what we're trying to get done here. So then in terms of what it takes to get one of these plans in the ground, for my staff time, more or less, takes about, our first plan was actually developed with a $10,000 grant from Patagonia, and it took probably 2 or 3 months because it's a lot of back and forth, a lot of working, and that depends mostly on the size of the operation, how complex it is, and all that. So then in this next step here, this is actually developed from a program that the state is now running. It's actually operating right now. It's called the Healthy Soils Incentives Program. So the state is actually incentivizing farmers to implement these management practices and providing, I think it's about a 50% financial incentive to get them to provide the other 50% and then ultimately do the practice. So based on that, the document that we were just looking at here in that table, I was able to input the values in the acreage and figure out that for Frog Hollow Farm to ultimately implement everything as we saw, we're talking on the order, or the state could potentially pay out $150,000, but that's just half the cost. So the farmer has to come up with the other half. These can get expensive, and there's cheaper ways to do them too. I would say that this is a very big carbon farm plan. And it may be that the farmer is able to find other ways to achieve those same management practices. So we do try to work with costs, because the last thing we want to do is give a farmer a huge list of things to do and then they find out they don't have the funding to do it. So we are cognizant of that. But these are just these are the things we're thinking about as we're doing this planning. So yeah, I mean, in general, I would say that it probably takes anywhere from, I would maybe drop that to say $8,000 to $15,000, depending on the size of the farm, to implement one of these. We're constantly looking for grants to do it. We've actually just got a grant. We're going to help Urban Tilth, who I mentioned earlier. They're an urban farm out in Richmond, to develop, I think, the first urban farm, carbon farm plan here in the state. Likewise, we're going to be working with a group just up in Solano County to develop a carbon farm plan for I think they've got a sheep wool operation, and then some orchard, and then some vegetables too. So they've got a lot of fun stuff that we're going to get into. And then implementation can be anywhere from, I would drop this maybe to say $40,000 to $200,000. You know, it can vary depending on how complex or how involved the farmer wants to get in all this. Yeah, so then I guess I can look at the chat. I see some questions rolling in here, and I'll read them aloud for everyone. So does Ben think of manure lagoons and the practice of spraying that into the air to dispose of it? Harris Ranch on I-5. Yeah, any hope that it might be used to fertilize fields? So yeah, I mean, I would say that driving through Harris Ranch is probably my least favorite part of visiting my family down in Southern California. But yeah, I mean, that's a practice I haven't mentioned much about. The compost application certainly is a practice that has utility out here in these ag lands. There was a lot of concern for a long time about it affecting water quality and maybe plant or nutrient or commodity quality too, but we've more or less found that that's not really an issue. So yeah, I would love to see those used in some other way than just disposed of. I know that here locally, they do try to do some of that. I've heard of a number of horse facilities that do try to get rid of their compost or manure by donating it to local farms. Then it's someone else's problem. I know that the UC Cooperative Extension, which is another group here in Contra Costa County, his name is Rob Benetton, I believe, works with the Oakland Zoo to go get some of their manure and then provide that to urban farms throughout Oakland and Berkeley and Richmond and El Sobrante over there in Western Contra Costa and Western Alameda County. So we are trying to reduce those things before they get to the landfill or before they're just disposed of elsewhere. Next question here. What is the most cost-effective strategy solution you have implemented, i.e. where can the farmers get the most carbon capture for the least money? That's a great question. I mean, that's probably going to be trees. A lot of the stuff that we like to recommend and talk about tends to be, I would say, short-lived. So cover cropping as a practice, for instance, is something that it's a Midwestern practice more. They like to put those down put seeds in the ground typically in like October when they're not going to harvest anything anymore. let that plant grow all winter and put nutrients into their soil, and then terminate the cover crop in maybe March or April so they can get in and plant their corn or plant their soy or whatever. Here it's a little different because we can harvest up until late November, and we can get planting in the ground as early as February. So the carbon benefits maybe not as great on that cover cropping. So that's why I would think probably any sort of hedgerow planting or windbreak is another one. I think, I don't know if I mentioned that one. Anything involving trees, they're going to be long lived and they're going to be there for a while. What role do or can Contra Costa County mayors and city council members do with policy to support the RCD? Yeah, I mean, I think the big one would probably be supportive of emerging urban farms. There are all manner of them. Every time I turn my back on Western Contra Costa County, a new urban farm springs up. They are popping up in community gardens. They are popping up in public parks. They are popping up in random dirt lots that just haven't been developed. Someone finally got a hold of. So putting food where people are rather than way out in the middle of Eastern Contra Costa, I think is a really effective way to support those guys and then bring a lot, I mean, again, a whole host of benefits to an area beyond just carbon sequestration. Yeah. Carbon sequestration amount for Frog Hollow based only on the models, or do the farms do any direct measurements of soil carbon before and after the intervention? So our planning is mostly through modeling, but the Healthy Soils program that I mentioned, one of the requirements of the program is that they do pre-testing, post-testing, and all that, and then monitor for a few years after they've done the practice to see if they're actually getting the carbon sequestration benefits. And I would say that on the whole, yeah, I mean, they funded it now. This is in its 5th year, I think. So I would say there's lots of good results coming out of that program, and each year it's gotten bigger. So I would expect to see it more and more down the road. Carol, businesses participating in COP26. I can't say much about COP26. I'm not an international environmental policy analyst, sorry. Ben, do you know what percentage of the county is farmland? And if they all had a carbon farm plan, what impact would they have together on total CO2 and Contra Costa? Thanks, Dean. So yeah, so I meant to start with that at the beginning of my presentation. So you were right on the money. I think we're more or less at about 400 farms right now. But I think I was just looking at the 2019 Ag Report, which is the latest we have data for. And I think we're up to about 186,000 acres of agriculture here in Contra Costa. Of that, I think it breaks down to about 14,000 is in row crop agriculture and orchards or vineyards, more traditional agriculture, so to speak. And then I think that leaves the other 170,000 in rangeland. So Mount Diablo State Park, Berkeley Hills, the Oakland Hills, all of that we classify as rangeland. So then the second part, what impact could they have together on total carbon in Contra Costa County? So we're actually working with Jody London, who is the county's sustainability coordinator. You guys might have had her on, I'm sure. She's great. If you haven't had her, bring her on, man. She can tell you all about all the cool stuff Contra Costa County's doing. But we just got a grant together through, I think it's the Department of Conservation at the state level, but the county is going to be taking a look at all of the land here in Contra Costa and trying to quantify where more or less the carbon sinks are. Where can we start to increase carbon sequestration on Contra Costa lands? We are in that grant, and we're going to be basically developing a 30,000 foot view carbon farm plan, so to speak, for the entire county to answer that exact question. So using some sophisticated modeling, some GIS, figuring out where practices could be implemented, where they can't be implemented, et cetera, to arrive at some value. Because right now I do not know what that number is, but I would love to have that number somewhere so that I can start making targets and saying, hey, let's work with this farm and let's try to get 1,000 tons sequestered every year or something, or at least identify ways that farmers can do it and then work with them to implement it so that we're not just planning and writing documents. That's ultimately where we want to get to, is this implementation. So yeah, more to come on that together, or more soon. Assume you are only working with organic farmers and those who use no pesticides. No use having cover crops for pollinator habitat if pesticides are killing the pollinators, which they are. So yeah, I mean, we work with pretty much anyone, both organic and conventional agriculture. I would say that we do advise farmers that, hey, you know, if you're actually trying to attract pollinators, probably want to hold up on spraying these weeds over here or working to remove these weeds. And again, more often than not, it's just the education pieces of it. You know, it's my father did it, my grandfather did it, his grandfather did it, and it goes back. So that's just how it's always been done. But communicating to these guys that, hey, there's another way, and it's still compatible with what you want to do and what you want to get out of your land. So yeah, we work with all sorts of folks and make all sorts of recommendations. Because yeah, the last thing I would like to do is put up a bunch of pollinator habitat, attract a bunch of monarch butterflies and bees, and then mow it all down or spray it or something like that. All right. I think that's it. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them live too. I think that's everything in chat.
Yeah, please, anybody, if you want to raise your hand and ask any questions that you haven't put in chat, feel free. I'll ask one, Ben,
Yeah.
as you're talking. I'll play devil's advocate just because it's been bothering me. I'm absolutely on board with the tree conservation and planting that you know, so many people talked about as, you know, nature's approach to this and what a great carbon sink that they can be. All I can think of is in California, you know, if we don't want to lose the trees we have, but every time it's, you know, a PG&E problem in the summer and something goes down and up go the trees, or it gets to be 110 degrees and a spark goes, all I think of more trees is packing the car and running from a giant fire. I wondered if we're as a state, not necessarily as a county, but if you had thoughts on trees as a plus versus a minus, specifically here in California.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be it's going to be tricky. It's not going to be something that I think can be, because there are those considerations that are absolutely that we need to be thinking about. And I think a larger part of that, and I mean, this could be a whole other topic I could talk about too, is the need to work with nature and probably get fire back out on the landscape as well through prescribed burning and clearing out and promoting the undergrowth of some of these forests. There's just so chock full of stuff that they're just waiting to go. But if we can promote that new growth, that's new carbon. That's a new carbon that's getting sucked out of the air. And yeah, I mean, but I would say that we can also be strategic with where we put trees, and also planting trees that are adapted for fire. Again, another thing I hate driving down to Southern California is, you know, seeing these windbreaks that someone planted, I don't know, probably in the 30s, 40s, or 50s, all this eucalyptus. You know, it's a non-native plant that is just a gasoline can waiting to go, you know, whereas the native species that we do have, yeah, they'll burn, but they're adapted for it. And they burn, I believe, a little less hot and a little less destructive. I mean, fire is destructive, so to speak, but just being really intentional with our planting, I think, is something that we're going to have to do if we want to put those in. Yeah,
that's a great point. Anybody else with a question? Otherwise, I'll talk. Oh yeah, Elizabeth Fisher. Looks like she has a question or a comment. Doesn't have to be a question.
Yeah, actually, I have basically the same question about what do they call it? About these native grasses, or the perennial grasses, actually. Yeah. I think I know there's Kernza has roots down to 15 feet, and I think they mentioned it also in the movie. So, but then it's got the fire issue too, I guess. So can you comment about grasses?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, Wendy Silver out of UC Berkeley, she does a ton of research on this. She's actually been really involved in this carbon farm planning effort too. One of the first carbon farm plans on the state was out in Marin, and I believe she assisted on it, doing some of the research on it, because her whole deal with the technology she was mentioning was compost application on rangelands, which is still, I would say, an evolving science. And I believe she also was in the documentary saying, you know, it's not a silver bullet, nothing's going to be, but you know, as we look at every possible solution to increasing carbon sequestration, I think putting the compost out on these rangelands and promoting the growth of these native grasses that are adapted for fire are going to be highly beneficial and put down a ton of carbon in these annual grassland systems. Again, another impact that we like to, or that you hear too, with these invasive grasses that get into maybe East Bay parks or in some of these rangelands out here is they're very shallow rooted. So when they burn, they basically burn the whole thing. And then that's when the rains come and the erosion and all that bad stuff. Whereas a lot of these native grasses are very deeply rooted because they're built for drought and they're built to pull the water from deep underground where they can get to it. So a fire may come through and take out the top part, but you're going to get regrowth pretty much the next year almost immediately. And to answer the fire aspects of it, I mean, I think that's where, I mean, with cattle and with goat grazing and all this beneficial grazing, we're returning more to a natural system that, you know, if you were to travel back in time 3,000 or 4,000 years, what are you going to see in this area? You're going to see a whole host of, you know, elk and other things grazing and eating all of these native grasses and promoting the growth. So taking the cattle off isn't exactly what we want to do either. We want to replicate that system. We want to give these grasses the ability to regenerate, to draw down more carbon, to put it into the cows, and then the cows are putting it back into the ground. So it's a whole great little cycle. So if we can effectively get them grazing and do it in a good way, I think we can reduce the wildfire risks significantly as well.
I wanted to note Eleanor Vincent's comment in chat about the fear of trees that I expressed, and noting that it is often where it's the people kind of infringing on tree land versus the other way. And if we keep some space between our forests and treed areas and development, that can be helpful, as well as she agrees with Ben on the need to do a lot more controlled burning. I'll ask one last quick question unless somebody else has one. Ben, I was just wondering, you've been able to obtain some funds, be it from Patagonia and other places, to help fund the work you're doing. What about the farmers facing that, you know, $40,000 to $200,000 fee? Is there any funding out there for them if they are tackling carbon sequestration approaches, or can could Contra Costa Board of Soups or others come up with funds to assist them to kind of help drive that effort?
I would say that at the state level, the state of California has recognized this, so they put together the Healthy Soils Incentives Program, which I just mentioned a while ago. So that's been pretty much an annual program that provides about 50% of the cost of those practices, and then the farmers are expected to provide the other 50%. That program is more or less modeled on a federal program through the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is our sister agency. They're basically the federal RCDs. But they run a program called the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. That's more or less the exact same thing, but it addresses all manner of resource concerns on farms and ranches, while the Healthy Soils Program is really only focusing on those practices that are sequestering carbon. So what we like to do, and I have yet to do it because the timing is really tricky, but get folks enrolled in both that, what we call EQIP, and then the Healthy Soils Program at the same time. So then basically they can get the whole practice covered by both the federal and the state government. And I would bet that down the line, we're probably going to see the value in this more, and I would bet more and more funding's coming down the way. The state has given a lot of attention to better managing our agricultural lands and increasing the conservation value of them, because for a long time we've been pushing the conservation value out because all we want is this row of corn. But we're now realizing, hey, in order for that corn to survive, we're going to need some other plants and some other trees around it too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for clarifying that.
Yeah.
So that's just about all the time we have. Again, I want to thank everyone who's joined us, and specifically Ben Weise again for participating in the Green Sofa Cinema series tonight. Hope you've learned about the latest tech approaches, whether we love them all or not from the movie, and about the role carbon farming can play right here in Contra Costa County as well as California. You can see in chat if you want to get more involved with any of our sponsor organizations. We've put links in. Ben earlier gave you his email and his colleagues' email on the Ag Conservation Program, so you can reach either of them. As I said earlier, we're taking December off, but the Green Sofa Cinema Series will return Wednesday, January 19th, as you can see on the screen, 7 to 8 p.m. Movie called Public Trust. It's about our public lands. That film is co-produced by Robert Redford and Patagonia's founder, Yvonne Chenard. It's won multiple awards and gets a 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. That's pretty darn good. Our speaker will be Gretchen Logue, co-founder of Tassajara Valley Preservation Association. You can watch for details by email from Green Sofa Cinema Series, any of our sponsoring groups. You can look at our social media sites and the Green Cinema Facebook page as well, and or watch for calendar listings in your local newspaper. So thanks again, everyone, and it's 8 o'clock. Enjoy the rest of your evening.